And Judge, does this move at all? Or is this one of those do not touch because of wires?
Yes, thank you.
Can I at least go like this,
Sure.
maybe? An early hunch became an assumption on which this case was built. And rather than meaningfully test the accuracy of that initial hunch, investigators were blinded by the desperation to preserve it. After a body was found in the remote area of Pingree Park, law enforcement conducted an autopsy and positively identified the individual as Scott Sessions. Based on that identification, the Larimer County Sheriff's Department reached out to the Greeley Police Department. Mr. Stan Sessions, the father of Scott Sessions, was at the Greeley Police Department to report his son missing, and the missing persons entry had just been filed with the national databases. The only information Stan had or could provide to law enforcement at the time was that he last spoke to his son the evening of February 8th. It was a brief conversation, maybe about 10 minutes. But in that conversation, Scott told his dad that he was going to meet someone in Fort Collins. And the conversation concluded when Scott indicated that he arrived at his destination in Fort Collins. However, Scott Sessions never went to Fort Collins. Scott Sessions was actually arriving at a destination here in Greeley, not that far from his own house. And that destination was the residence of Heather Frank. Investigators discovered that Scott Sessions was in fact never going to Fort Collins when they obtained the GPS data records from his cell phone. And those data records reflected that his phone last connected to a tower located at 3734 West 20th Street in Greeley, and 0.15 miles southeast of that tower. His vehicle was later found abandoned in the parking lot of the King Soopers grocery store off of 35th Avenue. So at this point, all law enforcement knew was that Scott Sessions told his father he was going to one place when he was going to another place. So law enforcement then searched his own residence, Scott Sessions' residence. And while they looked carefully for any type of evidence related to the disappearance or related to the death of Scott Sessions, they didn't find anything. What they did find was a series of usernames and passwords. And with this, Lieutenant Ben Hess of the Larimer County Sheriff's Department was able to successfully log into Scott Sessions' Facebook messages. And in reviewing those Facebook messages, he was able to find a recent conversation between Scott Sessions and Heather Frank. And in those Facebook messages, it reflected a lot regarding how they knew each other. They hadn't known each other for long. In fact, Mr. Sessions and Ms. Frank's Facebook connection was recent. January 23rd, 2020, they became Facebook friends, only 2.5 weeks before Mr. Sessions' body was found in Pingree Park. They were not in a committed relationship. They weren't even in a casual relationship. They weren't even friends. The dynamic of the conversation between the two of them on Facebook instead reflected a warm interest turned cold. It began with Mr. Sessions sending a virtual wave via Facebook Messenger to Ms. Frank on January 24th, followed by a message. Ms. Frank minimally replied that it was nice to meet him too, and To this, he tells her, quote, "Now you seriously have me craving coming over to Doug's for breakfast," with 3 emojis, including a heart. Miss Frank was an employee at the Doug's Day Diner in Loveland, and she responded to this message saying, quote, "Nice, you should. Sunday, I'll be there," and that she worked Sunday through Wednesday. Miss Frank asked him if he was going to see a particular band play that evening. To this, Mr. Sessions responded, quote, "You know, I kind of remember that they were playing. Do you remember where? I don't have a gig tonight, and that might be fun." And the two of them agreed to meet together and go to the event. Miss Frank told him that she would get an Uber there. And to this, Mr. Sessions responded, quote, "I'll make sure not to get too hammered so I can get you back safe to your place afterwards. Should really be a lot of fun." Now, the tone of the Facebook conversation is important. The tone of the Facebook conversation from that point on changed. And it changed because from that point on, it no longer reflected mutual interest. The next day, after the two spent the evening together, Mr. Sessions tried to communicate with Miss Frank. At 2:52 p.m., he messages her, quote, "What a super fun time last night. So," with multiple O's, nice, followed by 3 emojis. No response from Miss Frank. About 6 hours later, at 8:15 that same day, Mr. Sessions tries again. Quote, "Hey, how you doing? Hope you got some good rest today and hopefully feeling good too," with 3 more emojis. No response from Miss Frank. No response from Miss Frank that day. No response from Miss Frank on January 26th, on January 27th, on January 28th. No response from Miss Frank at all. And in fact, almost 2 weeks go by, and Miss Frank would not respond to Mr. Sessions. And during those 2 weeks, Miss Frank went to a blues jam that Mr. Sessions actually played at. She went with one of her 3 sons, Alex McLaughlin. And despite Mr. Sessions playing on the stage, she was able to successfully avoid him. Mr. Sessions didn't even know she was there, and so he persisted. Mr. Sessions made yet another attempt to get Miss Frank to respond to him, and he sent her a message on Facebook again on February 6th at 12:39 p.m. that reads, quote, "Hi Heather, how was your last week? Missed seeing you yesterday at the blues jam. But I'd love to tell you about the trip to Memphis. It was really cool," with an emoji following. No response from Miss Frank. Approximately 2 hours later, Mr. Sessions persists again, and he sends her another message, this time to an event, another musical event at the Moxie Theater. And it was clear that this message was just sent to more than just Miss Frank. It was a general invitation to other people. 4 hours later, Mr. Sessions finally gets a response from Miss Frank. And she tells him that she was, in fact, at the blues jam, just not on the dance floor, and then changes the topic of conversation to posts she had seen on his Facebook about a recent trip to Memphis. But the response was brief. She does not acknowledge Scott Sessions' prior messages. She does not indicate that she also had a good time with him the evening of January 24th and 25th. She does not acknowledge that night at all. Nor does she indicate any interest in going to the event at the Moxie Theater on February 6th. And just 2 days later, Miss Frank's cold, disinterested, and active avoidance of Mr. Sessions suddenly flips. On February 8th, Miss Frank messages Mr. Sessions, quote, "Want to come over?" And Mr. Sessions immediately takes her up on this invitation. "Sure, I just need to hop in the shower. How about I send you a message when I'm out and throw on some clothes? Sound groovy?" And the once completely unresponsive Miss Frank is now eager for Mr. Sessions to come over to her residence. "Hurry," she says. And the conversation from there also reflects that alcohol had been consumed between the two of them the evening of January 24th and 25th. Mr. Sessions asks if they need beer or if Miss Frank drank all the Crown. And Miss Frank tells him, quote, "Yep, I drink it all. Beer would be awesome." Mr. Sessions tells her he's on his way and then says, quote, "Warning, I smell pretty amazing." Miss Frank planned for Mr. Sessions to come to her residence that evening. Miss Frank initiated Mr. Sessions to hurry up and come over, and Miss Frank was the one who waited for Mr. Sessions to come over. Now, when Mr. Sessions' body was located at Pingree Park, it had been carried from a vehicle to the location where it was found by a downed tree. And his body was significantly burned. In fact, a majority of the lower portion of his entire body was burned and nearly burned off, his leg missing. But his head was covered, and his head was covered in a blue cloth that had been wrapped over plastic and secured by gray duct tape. And when investigators were present at the autopsy, they did a very careful job of collecting that duct tape. And the reason for that was they wanted to know who was it that wrapped Mr. Sessions' head in duct tape before his body was burned. And the DNA on that duct tape was Miss Frank's. Mr. Eastman, at this point, was an unknown, irrelevant person to investigators. That changed when the Larimer County Sheriff's Department went to Miss Frank's residence and noticed two vehicles outside of her home. Her red Ford Fusion and Mr. Eastman's silver Subaru Crosstrek. And after running the plates on the Subaru, officers learned it was registered to Mr. Eastman. Investigators also researched and learned that the Subaru's wheelbase was similar, but not exact, to the tire impressions at the Pingree Park scene. But it wasn't until they completed a background search on Mr. Eastman when investigators discovered a toxic relationship between he and Miss Frank, including allegations of domestic violence. And from that point on, investigators developed a hunch that Mr. Eastman was involved in the death of Scott Sessions. Now, you just heard Ms. Guthrie talking about the domestic violence relationship between Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank. And their relationship was unquestionably tumultuous and unhealthy. But it wasn't always that way. Like most relationships, it started off happy. Mr. Eastman had never been more in love, and everyone closest to him saw it and knew it. He was proud to bring her home to his family to meet them. And over the course of their relationship, Mr. Eastman proposed marriage to Miss Frank 3 times. Each of those 3 times, he was rejected. Mr. Eastman was all in. Miss Frank was not. The major catalyst of the relationship, though, was alcohol. The two had significant substance abuse dependency, specifically with alcohol. And the combination of those two with their severe addictions to alcohol created a relationship that was toxic, that was volatile, and at times violent. And you'll hear that within the first few moments of Mr. Eastman's interview with investigators, Mr. Eastman described the couple, quote, went through hell and back, treating each other bad. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Eastman is not a man without faults. Faults that he has never sugarcoated or denied. In fact, he candidly told detectives, quote, "Before that, I had been very abusive. I was physically abusive, and I know that was wrong, and I went to counseling." But with this hunch, investigators requested cell phone records from both Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank. And those phone records revealed that both Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank phones were near her residence the entire afternoon of February 8th. And both of their phones were at Ms. Frank's residence when Mr. Sessions arrived around 6:26 p.m. And all three of their phones remained that evening. From the cell phone records, investigators also discovered that Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank's phones left her residence at approximately 6:55 in the morning on February 9th and traveled northwest in tandem to the remote area of LaPorte, Colorado, facing Ted's place. Both cell phones lost signal at approximately 7:52 a.m., and both cell phones reestablished connection approximately at 11:49 a.m. and traveled back to Ms. Frank's residence again in tandem. That early hunch became an assumption on which this case was built. And that assumption was that Mr. Eastman was the type of person who was violent in the past with a partner, so he would be violent with anyone in the future. That assumption was that Mr. Eastman was the type of person who was abusive in the past, so he would be the type of person to be jealous in the future. And that assumption was that he must have been so irately jealous that Miss Frank had moved on to someone new that he slit someone's throat and took life. But these assumptions, like most, were inaccurate and not based on actualities. Over the years, Miss Frank's infidelities became something that Mr. Eastman would become used to. It wore him down to the point that he realized if he loved Miss Frank and wanted to be in her life at all, it would be something that he would just have to accept. He was no longer jealous. He was resigned. Their relationship would be on her terms and her time despite his feelings. And Mr. Eastman would rather have some time with her than nothing. But in August of 2019, Mr. Eastman had finally saved up enough money to move out of the residence that they shared and rent his own apartment. Finally, physical space. Mr. Eastman started to work on his sobriety, something that Miss Frank was not willing to do. And during this time, Mr. Eastman knew Miss Frank was still seeing other men. But again, he tried to focus on his sobriety and coming to grips with the realization that the relationship was not healthy. But he also struggled, again, with wanting to spend time with her when she would allow. Whatever attention or form of love that she was willing to give, he would accept. Things started to improve. However, Mr. Eastman was laid off from his job. And on December 24th, 2019, the unhealthy chaos of a toxic relationship that had been on and off for approximately 7 years finally came to an end when Miss Frank told him she wanted nothing to do with him anymore. Mr. Eastman at this point attempted suicide. And as a result, Mr. Eastman's sister, Miss Shelley Brinklow, who's always been more of a mother figure to him, stepped in. And on January 5th, Mr. Eastman moved over 250 miles away from Miss Frank to Parachute, Colorado, where Miss Brinklow lived with her and her family. And the brother and sister agreed that Mr. Eastman's move to Parachute would remain a secret. They did not want Miss Frank to know. And in fact, Miss Frank and her sons were told that Mr. Eastman was moving out of state to Arizona. And the reason for this was the two realized that Mr. Eastman would not have the strength to finally be done with Miss Frank and move on and get healthy if he was nearby and if she knew where he was. When Mr. Eastman arrived at Miss Brinklow's home, she describes him as a, quote, broken man. Mr. Eastman lived in Miss Brinklow's home for a little over a month. While there, he was working on his employment, working on healing, working on his sobriety, as sobriety was a deal breaker in Miss Brinklow's home. And during this time, Miss Frank was not ready to let go of the relationship. She tried to contact him, but was unable to contact Mr. Eastman because he had blocked her on phone and on Facebook. Mr. Eastman, at that point in time, was done. Miss Frank wouldn't accept that, though. She still tried to make contact with Mr. Eastman, including even an email she sent to him on January 18th, pleading with him to please talk to her. She also attempted to use her children to get in touch with Mr. Eastman. And the end of January came, and Miss Frank learned that Mr. Eastman was in fact still in Colorado. And as such, she booked a hotel room in Glenwood Springs and asked Mr. Eastman to go and meet her there. And this was a tough decision. Mr. Eastman was torn between someone he had been in an unhealthy, toxic relationship with for 7 years, who he loved more than anything, but the realization that he just couldn't go back to that. He could not go back to that point in his life. And after talking with his sister about it, he decided not to. Mr. Eastman rejected Miss Frank for the first time. He did not want to see her. He did not want to go to the hotel with her. And he struggled with this. And at that point in time, this was not the only thing Mr. Eastman was struggling with. He was struggling maintaining his sobriety. He was struggling gaining employment, meaningful employment. His phone was shut off or about to be shut off. He was about to lose his car. He was in a financial crisis. And so he relapsed. He went out drinking the night of February 7th with his nephew. And when he returned to his sister's home that morning on February 8th, around 7:30 in the morning, he came back and the doors were locked, the keys were changed, he couldn't go back inside. Where was he going to go? He went back to Greeley. And at some point, or somehow, Mr. Eastman found himself in a position where he was somehow even more broken. His phone turned off at this point. He needed money but had nothing. His return to Greeley, was not planned. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever was in his car. The return to Greeley was not planned. And when he got into town, he went to Miss Frank's residence, and he showed up unexpectedly. And he appeared around 2:22 p.m., and we know that from cell phone records on February 8th. And when he appeared, he asked Miss Frank for help to get him through until his unemployment check was coming. And she agreed to give him money, but only in exchange for his cell phone that he pawned to her. He asked her if she would go out to eat with him, get the boys together, the boys that he had seen grow up over the last 7 years. And she tells him that she has a date and asks him to leave. And he does. And he goes to Troy Bonnell's, leaving his cell phone at her residence. So investigators assumed Mr. Eastman was with his phone at Miss Frank's residence. And cell phone records from Mr. Eastman reflect that his phone, again, never left her residence that evening or that afternoon earlier, and neither did hers. So when looking at the phone records that indicated Mr. Sessions, Mr. Eastman, and Miss Frank were all at her residence all at the same time before Mr. Sessions was last heard from, of course, Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank were the obvious suspects. And arrest warrants for both Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank were issued by law enforcement. But investigators didn't arrest Mr. Eastman or Miss Frank immediately. Instead, they set up the pole camera outside of Miss Frank's residence to record nonstop. They put GPS tracking devices on both Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank's vehicles, and investigators watched every single move of Mr. Eastman and Ms. Frank's from February 14th on. And the GPS tracker, as did cell phone records later obtained, show that Ms. Frank went on her normal day-to-day activities. She drove herself to and from her job in Loveland. She got her nails done on February 11th. She went shopping by herself at Centera, had a normal dinner with one of her sons and his girlfriend, and investigators later talked to that son, and he told them Miss Frank seemed normal. So either Miss Frank witnessed or committed a gruesome homicide where a body was later burned and went on her day-to-day activities as normal. And on February 15th, the poll camera captured Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank leaving her home, getting into his car, all while carrying clothes, and Miss Frank walking on her own accord, visibly not appearing like she was under any sorts of distress. Donnie Robbins with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office observed GPS tracker on Mr. Eastman's vehicle leave Miss Frank's residence and traveled directly to the Will County Road 45 address in Kersey. Mr. Eastman's vehicle, and this is important, made no stops. The GPS tracker showed it went directly from one residence to the other residence. No detours, no stops on the side of the road even. By the time Donnie Robbins, though, arrived at the County Road 45 address, Mr. Eastman's vehicle was gone. Deputy Robbins followed the vehicle via GPS tracker to a location along the South Platte River. And although he didn't see anything, he was suspicious that the two were destroying evidence. And rather than stop the vehicle, Sergeant Robbins left. He returned the next day to the area of Highway 34 and Will County Road 45, where he noticed smoke from the property. At 267112 County Road 45, the residence belonging to Mr. Eastman's former colleague and now employer, Troy Bonnell. From the road, Deputy Robbins was able to see Mr. Eastman tending a small fire in a burn shed and assumed, again, that Mr. Eastman was destroying evidence relating to Scott Sessions' death. But subsequent searches of that burn pit would prove that assumption was wrong. Rather than watch, though, Deputy Robbins left again, and he went to locate any potential area evidence where the GPS tracker showed Mr. Eastman's vehicle the night before at the bridge. He still did not locate any evidence. Later, firefighters would come and conduct a grid search, a very careful search on the river, also not finding any evidence. Deputy Robbins at that point tells Captain Coleman with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office that he believed that Mr. Eastman was burning evidence. As Deputy Robbins went back to the Will County Road 45 address, though, he meets Mr. Eastman in the road. So Sergeant Robbins turns around and follows Mr. Eastman to the Phillips 66 gas station in Kersey. At that location, he sees Mr. Eastman with the gas canister filling up at the gas pump. And Mr. Eastman was arrested for the death of Scott Sessions based only on a hunch that became an assumption. Within hours, members of the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, with the assistance of the Greeley Police Department and the Will County Sheriff's Office, carefully executed a search warrant at both Ms. Frank's residence and Mr. Bonnell's property. At Ms. Frank's, investigators found signs that Ms. Frank was preparing to flee. Her bedding had been stripped. A large suitcase was found on the ground of her bedroom with clothes ready to go and her laptop nearby. And both her and Mr. Eastman's cell phones were left on the coffee table inside of her residence. Investigators were also able to confirm that Mr. Sessions' death occurred at the entryway of her residence, consistent with a quick ambush from behind with sharp force and major bloodletting. But also consistent with this information was what Mr. Eastman reported to law enforcement. When Mr. Eastman was interviewed by investigators, he told them that when he returned to Ms. Frank's house, he did so because he was concerned that she was going to get too drunk. And if she kept drinking past 8 p.m., she wouldn't be able to start her car early the next morning because of her interlock device installed in her vehicle. Torn between loyalty and the horror of what he saw and wanting to help police, Mr. Eastman told investigators that Mr. Sessions had to have been hurt somewhere pretty serious for the amount of blood he saw. He told investigators that there was, quote, blood every fucking where, as he struggled to breathe while telling them this. He also told investigators that when he saw the blood, he dry heaved over and over again because there was so much blood he couldn't stomach blood. The blood was also immediately upon entry, he tells them. And from there, he says, things just got out of control. And Mr. Eastman repeatedly tells investigators that he's sorry, he just can't tell them more, but he made a promise to someone. And while investigators were searching Ms. Frank's residence, investigators were also searching Mr. Bonnell's property for anything related to Scott Sessions' homicide. And Mr. Bonnell's property is large. It's a large ranch, and the residence is south to the burn pit. And Deputy Johnson was a field evidence technician at the time with the Weld County Sheriff's Office, and his assignment was to go with Larimer County and assist with the search warrant. And the trained professionals searched the property carefully, focusing on the burn shed. They removed burning material from the shed and covered it with dirt to preserve the evidence. No knives were located in the burn shed. No firearms were located in the burn shed. In fact, nothing related to the death of Scott Sessions was located in the burn pit. And while standing in the burn pit, the same area where they saw Mr. Eastman actively tending to this small fire, investigators noticed nothing. Nothing appeared to be abnormal. Nothing appeared to be concerning to them. And both Larimer and Weld County deputies walked the whole property, searched the property, focusing again on the burn pit area, and found nothing suspicious. Approximately 45 minutes into the search, Deputy Johnson took a break and walked out of the burn pit area and walked north past the dirt burns surrounding both sides of the burn shed and went to a porta potty that was already on scene. And while urinating next to the porta potty, he noticed the wooden table and thought that looks out of place. Still did not see anything though. He actually walked to the wooden table, walked to the wood pile, and still did not notice anything. It wasn't until he physically lifted up the table that he saw Ms. Frank's body. And law enforcement initially did not know it was her. They had to do an autopsy where they positively identified it as Ms. Frank. And as you heard, Ms. Frank was killed by 2 gunshot wounds to her left chest, both with small caliber ammunition. And the autopsy would only unfortunately find 1 bullet. The second bullet was never recovered. So with Mr. Eastman already arrested, already in custody for the death of Scott Sessions, and now Ms. Frank's deceased body was found, the assumption was that the cause of both deaths had to be Mr. Eastman. And that was cemented. And the foundation of this case was laid, and the foundation was that the assumption was, built on an assumption that Mr. Eastman was so jealous about Miss Frank moving on that he murdered them both. That was it. That's what it had to be. And the government has been blinded by their desperation to prove that, or to preserve that ever since. So at this point, we stand here today, and over 2 years have passed. And investigators have limited information and many assumptions when it comes, and no answers when it comes to the death of Heather Frank. Investigators know Miss Frank was killed by 2.22 long-range Remington brand bullets. But a tool marks examiner that they sent the request to examined one bullet recovered from Miss Frank and the 22 casings located in Mr. Eastman's pocket. And she will tell you she is unable to determine if the recovered bullet from Miss Frank matched the casings from Mr. Eastman's pocket. All she can say is that they're .22 caliber ammunition, and all she can tell you is that they're Remington brand. And she will also tell you that Remington brand is one of the four most largest brand companies to make these types of bullets, and they make billions of these bullets a year. Investigators located the lunchbox inside Mr. Bonnell's garage, and had Mr. Eastman's belongings in and around it. Also within the lunchbox, law enforcement discovered a case of 22 long-range Remington bullets and assumed that those bullets were his, and assumed that those bullets are what were used to kill Miss Frank. However, neither Mr. Eastman's DNA or fingerprints were located on the box or any cartridges inside. And while there was a small amount of Mr. Eastman's DNA located on Miss Frank, that was to be expected. They were cohabitating at the time. They were together at the time. But that's it. That is all investigators knew, and that is all investigators know. Investigators have not, to this day, found where Miss Frank was killed. They know she was alive when she walked to and got into Mr. Eastman's car, and they know the car drove straight to Mr. Bonnell's property with no stops, no detours, but there was no sign of a murder at Mr. Bonnell's property. And Mr. Bonnell told investigators that he never saw Miss Frank, and he thought Mr. Eastman left the property as soon as he dropped off his tools. He also told investigators that he was up most of the night and didn't hear or see anything. And neither did his girlfriend, Jennifer Edmonds, who was staying the night with him. And while trying to find where Miss Frank was killed, investigators turned to the GPS tracker. And they located several locations where Mr. Eastman went throughout northern Colorado, including the Pawnee grasslands. And that was over the course of the night from February 15th to February 16th. And again, law enforcement had done a careful search of Mr. Bonnell's property, so the only logical next step would be that the locations that Mr. Eastman went to that night had to bring them some evidence, had to show them where Miss Frank was killed. But it didn't. Trained investigators went to each location, and they knew exactly where Mr. Eastman went because they had the GPS data locations and because they could see the tire impressions in the ground. Trained investigators carefully searched, even utilizing a drone, and found nothing. No weapons, no murder site, nothing related to either death. And so that left one option. It had to be Mr. Eastman's car, right? And so investigators obtained and executed more than 3 search warrants on the vehicle. Investigators conducted a detailed and immaculate search and forensic processing of Mr. Eastman's vehicle. And they even used something called a crime scope that examined the vehicle using multiple wavelengths of alternate light source to identify stains. And they did locate 7 stains, but a chemical test called phenolphthalein was conducted, and that test is a chemical test that reacts positively to the presence of human blood. All tests indicated negative. There was no blood in Mr. Eastman's vehicle. Another assumption proven wrong. Investigators did locate some vegetation and a stain that smelled consistent with gasoline, but that was to be expected. Mr. Eastman was found at a gas pump filling up a gas can. Now, over again, 2 years have passed since both deaths. Over 2 years of investigation, and the government will still not be able to show you any murder weapon. They will not be able to tell you where Miss Frank was killed, and they will not be able to present you with any forensic or physical evidence that connects Mr. Eastman to either homicide. And most consequential, after over 2 years of investigation across multiple law enforcement agencies, nearly 100 witnesses, expert witnesses spanning from lay witnesses to expert witnesses with various forensic specialties, the government will not be able to provide or prove answers. Instead, the government will only be able to show a hunch that became an assumption. And because of this, you will have doubts. You will have hesitations. And because you have those doubts, because you have those hesitations, the only verdict will be not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take our mid-morning